following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Leanna Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This episode, we're talking about ageism. I wanted to do this topic last week, but I was waiting for a guest, a great guest, Dr. Ravi Chandra, MD, a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and the author of 4 books on very, very diverse topics. He'll be here joining us later to discuss his insights into ageism in the media and what we can do about it. And we're going to focus on the Joe Biden stuff there. But first, I set the table. It's Not Therapy is proud to be supported by Phases Executive Fitness Studio. Phases is more than just personal training, physiotherapy, chiropractic, osteopathy, massage therapy, Pilates, and yoga. For over 25 years, directors Kathy Nielsen and Garrick Nelson and their team have taken functional rehabilitation to another level, incorporating wellness to empower their clients to take control of their own health, personalized exercise plans, leading-edge nutrition, physical therapy, and personal wellness services that benefit your physical and mental health. It's all here for you at Phases Executive Fitness Center. You can find them in North York by visiting phasesexecfit.com. That's Phases of the Moon, phasesexecfit.com, P-H-A-S-E-S, phasesexecfit.com. All right, let's get into it. Kamala Harris, full swing brat summer in the U.S. election cycle. And isn't it nice to see the media talking about how energetic and vibrant a 49-year-old woman in the public eye is, instead of guys like Don Lemon saying women that age are past her prime? There's been a lot of talk about Biden, like I said, and ageism, and it's valid, but the tech bros are hitting the age of the guys they love to fire 20 years ago, and they're being, well, word of the month, really weird. It's just weird. Their insecurities and lack of emotional maturity are on full display, and all of that would be, schadenfreude if they weren't damaging the stock market every time they mess up. Hello, NVIDIA this week. Okay, there's been a run of men in the last few years in their 60s casting love interests in their 40s in their movies. I'm looking at you, Tom Cruise. At least Harrison Ford cast Phoebe Waller-Bridge as his friend's daughter. This is all really weird to me because one of my absolute favorite shows when I was a kid was The Golden Girls. Ironically, Kamala Harris is the same age as Dorothy and Rose in season 4 of The Golden Girls, and Blanche around season 6. Obviously, being in one's late 50s is not what it was 40 years ago, and yet, if anything, ageism might be getting worse. Okay, in fairness, the 20-year age gap in movies, that's been going on since at least Jurassic Park, when Laura Dern was 20 years younger than Sam Neill, but the characters, as originally conceived, were supposed to be Ellie, Laura Dern's character, in her late 20s, and Alan, Sam Neill's character, in his mid-30s. So, make of that what you will. The bigger issue is real people. For instance, the average life expectancy in Canada, 1985, when the Golden Girls premiered, was 76. It's now over 83 years old. Now, U.S. life expectancy has always been lower, 74 and a half years in 1985, 79 years now. Either way, people are spending significant time in their retirement years, and that gap is growing. There are over 50 million retirees at last measure. That was in 2023. There are 7.6 million retirees in Canada, but 50 million retirees in the US, 10 million, over 10 million more retirees in the US than the entire population of Canada. And yet we treat people terribly the minute they start showing signs of aging. There's a particular animosity for the baby boomer generation, which we don't have time to get into today. But there's a reason. The highest risk of suicide, what is it? We usually think about teens, but the highest group for suicide risk is men 45 to 54 years of age. Right at the age ageism starts to kick in, resulting in career setbacks and financial losses. So while we've been focused on Biden and ageism of late, it's important to recognize that ageism is a form of discrimination that affects people for almost half of our lives, which is why the ageism directed at Joe Biden, especially by the media, is important to talk about, because 80 for politicians is 50 for everybody else. You're allowed to be old a lot more in politics than, jobs where you live paycheck to paycheck. And that's messed up. So after the break, I'll talk to Dr. Ravi Chandra, Distinguished Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, author of 4 books on ageism, not authors of books on ageism, author of 4 books. He's going to talk about ageism on It's Not Therapy. I'm having a rough show. Maybe I'm getting old. Questions, comments. I like feedback. That last thing was a joke. Leanna at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is our website. Join our mailing list. Fill out the contact form at Not Therapy Show on social media. Ageism, why you should care at any age, when we come back on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we're still talking ageism and why you should care about ageism at any age. This episode of It's Not Therapy is still sponsored by Phases Executive Fitness Studio, phasesexecfit.com for all your fitness and personal wellness needs. Again, that's Phases Executive Fitness Studio, Phases, Phases, execfit.com, phasesexecfit.com. And it is time for the interview, and I've got a great guest this show. We've got Dr. Ravi Chandra, psychiatrist, writer, and compassion educator in San Francisco. He's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He's got a he graduated from Brown University, Stanford Medical School. He's got a lot of credits. He's also a writer for Psychology Today, Eastwind Ezine, essays on film for the Center of Asian American Media for 14 years, regularly teaches for the American Psychiatric Association and other venues, debut nonfiction book, Face Buddha, Transcendence in the Age of Social Networks, won a 2017 Nautilus Silver Award, debut documentary feature, The Bandage Place, From AIDS to COVID and Racial Justice, awarded Best Film at the 2021 Cannes Independent Film Festival. Both are available online. You can follow him on Substack, sign up for monthly newsletter, ravichandramd.com. Now that lengthy introduction, Ravi, that went a while. Your credentials, and I think it's important because after the whole, I said, Julius Caesar starring Joe Biden, right? A2, the Democratic Party happened. I was like, I need to do a show on ageism because it's real, it's poorly understood. And I really pounded your credentials because I think a lot of people don't want to hear it, because I think that ageism, it's one of those indicators that indicates there's a lot of other things going on in a society that need work. Let's start there. Am I right or am I wrong?
Oh, 1,000% right. It's just another one of those tips of the iceberg to get at the underlying problem. And I think we might both agree that American culture is an extremely individualistic culture. And the problem is that life is not just about us as individuals, but about relationships and relatedness and the social environment. And that includes both cultivating good relationships and dealing with difficult and challenging relationships. But when you have an individualistic, youth obsessed culture that is slanted to advantage rich, wealthy, white males, who is going to have more stress and problems? I would say generally the poor, the old, the disabled, the non-white, and the non-male. And because we are all related, this throws problems back onto all of us. And frankly speaking, some men have limited, they have received limited empathy, and they often have limited resources socially and social skills, and some have challenges in being empathic. And some people, in general, have little inclination to be pro-social in times of distress or be pro-social to those with distress. So I think that's kind of the nutshell there. But stress and conflict can just get into our heads and either sink us or send us on power trips of some kind. And we see that, in all kinds of ways in society. So I think the real problem is basically power trips versus relationships versus feeling disempowered and relationship less. So you've heard the phrase, you can go faster alone, but we go farther together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, here in Silicon Valley, there's a culture of moving fast and breaking things.
Things. Yeah.
And they're kind of breaking the planet as they try to go it alone and without listening to people like us.
Yeah. I swear, guys, Ravi did not listen to the last few weeks of the show. We've been talking a lot of things you hit on. The idea of uh identity threat kind of having a boomerang, and
Yes.
even the us versus them in the way we deal with this problem is making the problem worse, right? Silicon Valley is sort of
Really.
hotbed
Hotbed,
of,
yes.
yeah, this crisis of identity of,
Hmm.
I can say this because I am a nerds who have tried to
Hmm.
do this sort of performative masculinity, and now they're like, what do you mean I'm the problem? And these guys are starting to hit their 50s.
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
about the time that ageism starts kicking in.
Yeah.
And it seems like some of them are adapting better than others. And the article you wrote indicated two markers. And I found this
Hmm.
really, really, really interesting. At first, I was like, huh? And then the more I thought about it, makes sense. You said we've already talked about the masculinity component and that competitiveness, that cutthroat competitiveness.
Hmm.
But another marker that indicated more ageism in society was long-term orientation.
Hmm. Hmm.
And can you unpack what that means and how it connects?
Yeah. So, what the authors of that particular paper did was they studied a bunch of news sources from a bunch of countries in English language speaking countries and web sources, and they just looked at the language used around age. And so, after controlling for certain cultural dimensions, they found that masculinity and long-term orientation were markers for ageism and negative stereotypes about age. So long-term orientation is basically delayed gratification, and therefore the society's relative emphasis on investing in youth, and then basically devaluation of the old, because there's no economic payoff. There's less economic payoff with older people, right? So it's a very kind of shallow, productivity oriented way of thinking. I mean, it's good to be able to delay one's gratification, etc. But what is the gratification of
Right.
life as we age and when you're old, and maybe start to have physical problems or health issues of some kind? What value does society place on you?
Hmm.
So that's a big part of ageism. I mean, I think a lot of older people feel like they become irrelevant and isolated. Although generally, I think the mental health markers are that happiness tends to improve
Mm-hmm.
after a dip in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
So but I think feeling connected socially is very important. So I think this is an important marker, especially as I'm 57 years old right now. So I'm thinking, well, what's it going to be like to be older, and what's it like for my mom, and other friends' parents as they age. And we're kind of the sandwich generation, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have kids, but with the sandwich generation, taking care of our parents as well as our kids, well, it's a lot of the millennial, not sorry, Gen X, I think is we're generally the sandwich generation right now. So, how I hope we're generally thinking about what would society look like to care for people throughout the lifespan, our children, our parents, and also us, So without anybody burning out as much as they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm later Gen X myself, and I think back to my high school days, back in the
yeah,
90s,
yeah, yeah.
when they were actively teaching us to resent older people. We were taught,
Hmm.
well, the boomers aren't going to retire, and there's this population bubble, so you're not going to have jobs.
Hmm.
And it was a real doomsday scenario, and it really, first of all, left us feeling very hopeless, and it caused
Hmm.
a lot of
Mm.
anxiety. And
Mm.
you talked about in your article how anxiety sort of unplugs rational
Hmm.
thinking. And I do think that, the millennials got it even worse than we did. And now we have alphas who are terrified of aging. The
Hmm.
stuff we're
Hmm.
seeing about, you know, um, kids in their early teens using anti-aging products, which they don't
Hmm.
need and are not great
Right,
for their skin. It can cause
right.
damage, but they're so afraid of getting old. And
Hmm.
they're disrespecting older people, but they're also
Hmm.
not enjoying their youth because
Right.
they're just so afraid of aging. So,
Yeah.
how does that anxiety connect? Because you make an interesting connection in the article.
Well, again, I think amplified by social media, people have become really super conscious of their looks and the idea that perceptions, what's on the surface, matters most, right?
Right.
And that can put people into a lot of body image issues and anxieties. The rates of plastic surgery have skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
Gene Twenge and Keith Campbell talk about that in their book, The Narcissism Epidemic. So, I mean, and social media is definitely tied up with that. And so I think also there's this in terms of devaluing the old. There's an old joke that's when I was 18, I thought my old man was really dumb.
Mm-hmm.
After 4 years later, I was amazed at how much he learned. So
Yeah.
right, suddenly realizing, oh yeah, oh they're not so dumb after all. Maybe they've got something. But right now the generation divide is pretty steep. So I would think a lot of younger people are looking at older people, some older people who don't get the issues of climate change, racial justice, all of this, and they're like, what are you expecting, to leave for us? And a lot of young people, I think there's some there's discord. I can imagine there's tension. There is tension, right, between generations. And I think if we could all just focus on being human, um, uh, Hugo Black said, "We are all just children grown tall." So how does that express at 70 years old?
Mm-hmm.
How can we all see ourselves as having that same element of the elements of humanity, no matter what age we are?
Mm-hmm. I
Mhm.
want to get into the social media angle of the age difference, and with Kamala coming on the scene, uh Gen Alpha slang
Mm.
things like she's brat, the
Right.
linguistic differences
Mhm. Yeah.
between I want to get to that. We're going to take a quick break on Ixnok therapy and be back with Dr. Ravi Chandra, Distinguished Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, poet, writer, filmmaker, lots of stuff, very smart, compassionate guy, compassion educator. At that, talking ageism, why you should care at any age, questions, comments, feedback. I like it. Leanna at nottherapyshow.com. Not Therapy Show is the website. Fill out the contact form while you're there. Not Therapy Show on socials. When we come back, more on ageism and the media on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I am still not a therapist. We are still in the interview talking ageism, why you should care at any age. This episode of It's Not Therapy is still brought to you by Phases Executive Fitness Studio, phasesexecfit.com. That's Phases like the moon, PHASES, execfit.com, phasesexecfit.com. And I am still here with Distinguished Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, Dr. Ravi Chandra, MD, and we're talking ageism and the media. And obviously, social media is very youth driven. We've seen a lot of statistics on, just how bad Instagram is for teenage girls in terms of self-esteem. But again, we slice this up into demographics and don't look at the big picture, right? Because you can't just pull one group of people out of society. It's like, that's it. That's the whole picture. What have you seen with social media? What's driving? Is it the personal brand? Is it this fierce competitiveness instead of a more cooperative concept of society? What's driving this youth obsession on social media?
Oh, wow. Well, so big question. I wrote a book, as you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
about social media. And I think obviously young people are generally more tech savvy. They've grown up with it.
Yeah.
They just get into it. They learn about it. They learn to be very adept at making videos and all of that. And I guess a lot of people in general got into TikTok and short form videos. So, not just the young. So, I mean, so there's a way where it's a participatory kind of art exercise, but it's also opens up to a lot of sociopathy and just, I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of distress that gets expressed online. And, so the youth that are on social media, I think they can explore. You can connect if you have a non main, well, I say not one of the non-dominant identities, so to speak. If you're from a marginalized, vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
minoritized population, you can find community. Okay, that's a good thing. But then, I think again, the dominant culture of that happens online, of presentation, of curation, of showing off your highlight reel, is can that can also happen too. So, so how much support are you getting? How much empathy and compassion and relatedness versus how much social comparison
Yeah.
and toxicity? So I think that's true at any age. So but I think that's particularly, I think the youth may have fewer kind of resources emotionally and so forth as they're engaging. But disinformation affects older people, and that's another thing.
Right.
So all the tech bros, the tech elite. Why can't they focus on maybe using AI more as a way to help older
Mm-hmm.
people and all people with disinformation, for example, or just with sorting my mom's inbox and getting rid of phishing and scam and
Yeah.
fraud and all of that, because that's scary. I think when we're older, we're even more susceptible to that stuff, but I think anybody can get hooked. So, I mean, it's like the tech community, I think is interested in the shiny disco balls where they can maybe make some money. Oh, how to write poetry with AI. I'm sorry, I
Mm-hmm.
don't need that. I don't
Yeah.
need that. So how can it help us rather than help our humanity rather than quasi substitute for humanity? I mean, I don't think we need that.
Yeah, and it's like the tech industry would like to remove as many people of from the equation of existence as possible. Meanwhile,
Right.
what people are actually doing with technology is a lot of community building, and the linguistic community building online is fascinating, but it definitely, like I said before the break, drives a wedge between the generations with
Mhm.
Charlie XCX coming out and deeming Kamala Harris brat
Mhm.
led to one of the saddest segments on CNN I had ever seen.
Oh my gosh.
It was
The
it, they
the
were all
diagramming, the
they were
diagramming of the word brat.
they were all Gen Xers, but it was
Mhm.
so boomer. And I'm like, what's going on? There was not one person, late millennial alpha on there actually explaining it. It was
Mm.
visually just old people explaining it to old people. And this is when I'm like, oh my God, they weren't that old. What is going
Yeah.
on here kind of
Uh,
culturally?
Okay, so well, one of my favorite, absolute favorite doctors, Dr. Lewis Thomas, he wrote The
Hmm.
Lives of a Cell. He wrote in one of his essays, language was born from babies' babble.
Hmm.
I think that's true evolutionarily, right? The youth, in this little playpen or whatever, they just invented words to communicate, and that became language. All right, so that's kind of what's happening on so it's all right. But and that has resonance, that becomes a thing or whatever. But yeah, how do we communicate across society? And mostly, I think it's about the emotions that are underneath all of those words, you know? And
Hmm.
how do we like cultivate like understanding of our own emotions and other people's emotions? Um, and maybe there we can meet in different ways rather than just being, flippant or cool or whatever. That's
Hmm.
fine. That's
Hmm.
fun. I mean, everybody can have fun with language. I'm a poet. I have fun with language too. But like, yeah, let's get back to emotion and feeling and soul and depth. That's the spirituality. Language is just the window dressing, so to speak, on our humanity.
That's a good way of putting it because one of the things I find with getting older is you make more mistakes. And so you're more understanding or you have more runway for people who mess up. And I do
Mhm.
think that is one of the things that happened with the really really going back to the Joe Biden thing, the fact that it did just seem like a narrative got established,
Mhm.
people really just gave him no dignity in the
Yeah,
time to make a choice. And
yeah,
the problem with this issue is that the young cannot jump forward and understand what it's like to have experience. So it is somewhat incumbent upon us as what did you refer to it? Gen X as the sort of caretaker generation? Is that what you called it?
right. The sandwich generation.
Sandwich
Yeah,
generation. Thank
yeah,
you.
mhm,
As
yeah.
a sandwich generation to kind of go, okay, let's have some respect for uh older people, but let's
Mhm.
also make some space and not be quite so dismissive of those young people. Because I remember when I thought I knew how the world worked and everything was really easy to fix. And then I made a lot of mistakes. And now I go, ah, that was cute.
Mhm.
Do you think some people who are sort of our general age could be doing more to bridge that gap? Because I mean, we might have a Gen X president. They said it wasn't going to happen, but
Mhm. Mhm.
that's the
Yeah.
way Gen X rolls. Everybody forgets about us until they need us. That's another thing, though, right? It's you
Yeah.
mentioned in the article, it's what causes people to get attention, and it does tend to be negative. You mentioned that. I forget exactly what you said, but nobody notices unless you disappoint or
Mhm.
uh
Disobey or disagree.
disobey or
And then they
disagree.
attack and then
Right,
they attack. Like,
right.
why, what is that? That's that's
And
crazy.
it's always been that way, and yet not quite so much,
Yeah.
if that makes any sense. There was a greater tolerance, even though we had our moral panics in the 1980s,
Mhm.
there was sort of a greater tolerance for, say, art that offends or things that were not to our taste. What do you think's happening there? Because this all seems to be just a continuum of intolerance versus compassion.
Well, it's I think basically, if you want my opinion on it, it's not a hot take that there's too many hot takes. I mean, people basically, after Biden's debate performance, there was underlying anxiety in the whole population about his age, and more people rated Biden as being too old for the job as opposed to Trump, even though they're almost the same age. And
Hmm.
you could easily question Mr. Trump's cognitive abilities, etc. I mean, based on how he talks and his changes over the years as well. But
Right.
the journalists are focused on Biden's debate performance as opposed to Trump's lies, etc. It's very interesting. Why did they do that? I joked maybe Biden should have brought his German Shepherd commander to the debate, and
Just
then
bite
everybody would
everybody.
get the one to
Yeah.
bite everybody,
Yeah.
But so they freaked out about Biden's slips and whatever, and that turned into a hot take, a story like he's too old, he can't do this, he can't, it just a narrative of decline. So their
Hmm.
emotions, their anxiety turned catastrophic and turned into a story. Biden must go, very quickly.
Hmm.
I was even kind of, as soon as the late night talk show hosts all came out and said that, it was about 8 days later, they were all on vacation the week right after. I was like, okay, it's kind of done. There's no way that anybody could withstand that level of disconnect with, the population as these performers were, kind of seeing it. But still, it's like, it could have happened differently if we'd have slowed down,
Yeah.
been more kind of reasonable. Like, okay, well, what are the cognitive requirements? What are the relational requirements? What are the leadership qualities, the character qualities that we want in a president? Does Biden have those? And I would argue, yeah, he had all of those. He might be
Yeah.
slow. He's been making gaffes for 50 years, So I mean, maybe there needed to be a more formal fitness evaluation for all candidates and elected officials, and maybe something like that. But this was just based on perceptions and storyline and all about power, and the journalists especially. I think really wanted to be the fourth estate on this and
Hmm.
basically become the deciding authority. And I think that really bothered me as well. After Biden stepped down, Peter Baker wrote an analysis, which he, kind of dinged the president for not being introspective enough in his Oval Office address. I'm like, oh God, it's like,
Yeah.
do you guys even like look at yourselves? So it's like, yeah, all of that, it's kind of advanced bullying, I think.
Yeah, and
So
cognition isn't judgment. You make a very
yeah.
good, important distinction there. John Fetterman, for instance,
Mhm.
has
Right.
a cognition issue because of the stroke, but his judgment is not impaired. And,
Exactly. Thank you. Yes.
politics aside, you want someone a little slower off the mark in terms of judgment, because rushing to judgment is a lot of fallacies, a lot of cognitive errors build
Yeah.
up when you rush to judgment.
Absolutely.
And
I would argue that character is the most important feature. Somebody who's going to listen to everybody and then have a solid character to make the decisions that are good for the whole population.
Yeah, and that isn't a question of being slow to respond. That's a
Mhm,
question of having the wisdom, the
mhm. Thank
experience
you.
to go,
Yes.
okay, it's like, do you want, this is such a nerdy analogy, but do you want Kylo Ren or Yoda running the country, right? Well, in US politics, Yoda's unelectable right now.
Accent have I too?
Oh, you never. Yes. Oh God, look, check us out. But it this is a much bigger thing, which is why I wanted to have you on. The wisdom of people who have been around a while. Now, again, the alphas, younger millennials are befriending old people. And it was
Mhm.
very interesting to see the reaction on social media to, you said the media made the decision with Biden. They practically locked in the narrative. But I think it was George Clooney's op-ed that really sealed the deal.
Yep.
And the George Clooney's a very smart guy and he's very socially involved, but we are taking our foreign policy cues from an actor? Really? I mean, okay,
Really, I
his
know, I know.
his wife
Uh,
is very smart, but he's an actor.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that it was nice to see the younger social media users when he endorsed Kamala Harris
Right,
going, shut up, George Clooney.
right,
You're a
right,
betrayer. We're not listening to you. This is
right,
our show now. And
right.
that gave me some hope because it does seem that as fearful of age that teens and young adults are right now, they do seem to sort of have those basics of character, maybe because they're facing a very, very, very scary world. And if we can just reduce the anxiety, I think
Mhm.
they can do this. Do you agree?
100%. So, yeah, so okay, I didn't even read, I couldn't even bring myself to read George Clooney's op-ed or guest essay or whatever they call them now.
It was
Um, yeah,
difficult.
yeah, I just couldn't because yeah, all those reasons. And okay, I'll just say, let's say George Clooney got a little anxious when he was around Joe. Okay,
Hmm.
Joe seemed a little bit whatever it was. You know who else is a little bit might need a little help? It's I don't know, George Clooney's parents or this is what I'm saying. It's like, oh
Hmm.
yeah. I mean, our parents can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable or anxious or even frustrated as they get older and things they get fatigued or whatever. All of that. Well, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna get uh angry and or just like say, oh, I'm sorry, you're just maybe you take the car keys away. I mean, that's what some people say. This
A
is
lot
like
of
taking the
people
car
do.
keys.
Yeah.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. I mean, okay, but are you gonna be mean? Are you gonna go out on social media and say, oh, my so and so, my mom or dad is just really, you know, junking it up or whatever? I mean, that's kind of what happened. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
hello, it's like, how do you relate to changes in another person? And so there's all these biases that, whatever George Clooney said, I mean, we've all got biases. And I just wonder, was he able to kind of check his biases as he was dealing with that uncomfortable situation, that new situation?
Yeah, and we
So
don't know
yeah,
because there's been no disclosure
mhm,
about medical test. I mean, those cognitive
right.
tests are fairly basic anyway.
Right,
You
right,
you
right.
can
Well,
pass a
there are more, right, they're more comprehensive ones, but still they're not ironclad and absolute. They're like a modest level of scientific predictability, for people within a certain range, we can always take the even expert opinions with a grain of salt, but I think we needed more objective data than George
Mhm.
Clooney's appraisal.
Right. And
Mm,
that's a huge problem because then we get into a society where what do those people do where we're living longer and longer. I mean, we talk about the tech people not being able to find jobs in their 50s. They get laid off and they can't
Oh,
find a
yeah.
job with that
Mhm,
income. It's becoming a massive social problem. And I do find it
mhm,
interesting that the countries with the most ageism in the English speaking world are the UK, followed
mhm.
by Canada and a couple other places. But a
And the
socialized health,
US.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
but how can we start to turn this around? Because this is a social problem that isn't going away.
Well, going back to this point, I mean, I want to also take this study with a little bit of a grain of salt,
Mhm.
because, I think, the what's analyzed in web news sources
Right.
may be different than what's actually happening
Good point.
between people, but it is a snapshot of what the media layer is saying about older people. Um, I think this could be a marker for countries where web media tends to be more aggressive. You know,
Mhm.
there's something else there. Yeah. So I'm sorry. What was your original question
Well, it's
about that? Yeah.
it sounds like we're back to the tone down the hot takes,
Yeah.
right?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a
Mhm,
way to inflame people and keep them reading longer, not really informing them.
mhm.
It sounds like a bit of a reflexive recursive problem that's going to take a bit to sort out. But hey, we're having the conversation. We're trying, right? Ravi Chandra,
Right.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Distinguished
Thank you.
Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, Ravi Chandra, MD. That's RAVICHANDRAMD.com. Check him out online. His stuff's really, really insightful on Psychology Today and other places. Dr. Ravi, have we covered everything? Is there anything you want to say in closing?
Uh, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I would say the school of life is an interdisciplinary exercise, but we all need to major in the art of staying human.
All right, with that, I'm gonna throw to the most awkward commercial break ever. Not much human. Well, I guess it's human sponsors. Questions, comments, any feedback. That's very human. Leanna at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. Join the mailing list, fill out the contact form. At Not Therapy Show is social media. When we come back, wrapping up, final thoughts on ageism, why you should care at any age, what to do about experiencing ageism, whether you've caught some ageism in yourself. We'll see. I'm going to wing it when we come back on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking ageism, why you should care about ageism at any age. And this episode of It's Not Therapy is still brought to you by Phases Executive Studio, phasesexecfit.com, PHASES execfit.com, phasesexecfit.com. And okay, so the interview with Dr. Ravi Chandra went all over the place because it's really hard to extract ageism from other insecurities. And as he talked about anxieties, and I do want to pick up on what he was talking about compassion and focus on my top 10 phrase. Self-esteem cannot exist without self-compassion. The thing about bullies, the people who pick on people's age, people's weight, people's looks when it's not relevant, so on and so forth. They're telling on themselves, right? How compassionate you are to others reflects strongly on how compassionate you are with yourself. So if you're lashing out at people about petty stuff, if you're bringing up things that aren't really relevant and just are a cheap shot, that says a lot about what you're afraid of, what you think your weaknesses are, and where you're rough on yourself. And I want to tell you guys right now about the first time I experienced ageism. I was 28 years old. Yeah, this was the point where I grew up a lot because we were out in Alberta doing a promotional tour for one of the, Ed and Red's Night Party DVDs, and Much Music that Ed was on, I was producing at the time, wouldn't have me on at the ripe old age of 28. They claimed I was out of the demographic. Carmen Electra had been there a couple weeks ago. She was 33 at the time, but yet 28 years old, out of the demographic. This is a shining example of how ageism is used as a placeholder. It's seen as a more acceptable reason to reject someone rather than what people really want to say. And that says something about how acceptable ageism is in our society. People, it's not nice to be mean to old people, but the boomers drive me crazy. And as, Dr. Ravi Chandra was talking about, yes, sometimes older people can be stubborn. They can be set in their ways. They don't understand certain things about how the modern world works, or they do. They just don't terribly care and want to stay in their own little corner of it, and don't bug them with it. And here's the thing. It can be incredibly invalidating to you. It is better to tell them how you feel about how their attitudes, their outdated attitudes, are making you feel, rather than just lash out in frustration and cruelty because you think they don't understand and they're making you feel bad. Yes, we cannot expect the young to have the wisdom of the old, even when some old people lack wisdom. But how you treat people older than yourself dictates what you are prepared to be faced with when you get to that age. And people say, I'll be able to handle it. I'll understand. I'll get out of the way. No, you won't. If you listen to anything I've ever told you, listen to this. And speaking of, passage of time, I am out of it. NotTherapeutic.com is the website for any questions or concerns. Big thank you to Phases Executive Fitness Studio, our sponsor for this episode, phasesexecfit.com. See you next time. Remember, your crazy old or young is only a problem if it's hurting you. See you next time.